Must you carry a struggle in your heart forever? The terrible toil of combat, old contender? Will you not submit to the immortal gods? This nightmare will never end because it is eternal evil, horror, anguish, and anarchy. There is no battling it, and no force can stop it. All that's available is a flight. The Odyssey. Dear James, I'm writing to let you know that your continuous queries about the Byron House event have finally worn away whatever remaining reluctance I may have had about discussing it openly. I've warned you enough in my numerous responses over the years, but if you still want to hear the truth about what happened in that accursed house on that accursed night, read on. However, I strongly advise you not to do so. Some things are better left buried in the past, or, in this case, beneath the burnt rubble and crumbling stones of that terrible edifice. I do not find it easy to write this letter. Even now, the events of that night induce panic and a chilly dread to spread across my skin. Even recalling what I witnessed that night and the steps I took to put an end to it makes my mind reel with panic at what nebulous horrors may still linger beneath the bricks and mortar of that terrible building. Although my account is undoubtedly limited in scope, it hints at a much larger gathering of terrifying forces at work in the hidden, shadowed corners of the earth and beyond. The lurking unknown that layers the twisting vistas of the most profound cosmic spheres and the lightless chasms of the unnameable blackness of the outside. I've long ago burnt all of my diary entries about Byron House and my following correspondence with occultists, pseudoscientists, and fringe scholars from around the world. All that remains is the letter you are holding in your hands. Because I destroyed all written records of what transpired at the house, I'm relying solely on my memory to recount the dark specifics. The horrible fact is that I've forgotten a lot of it, and what remains feels like fevered hallucinations from an oversensitive and morbid mind. It may be for the best that I struggle to recall the specifics of the situation, a blessing for both of us, in fact. I will now describe the tragic chain of events that led me to flood the attic room of Byron House with gasoline and burn the building down to cinders, leaving only one tenant. You may recall that I have always been fascinated with mental diseases and the poor souls who suffer from them. In my younger years, before becoming a doctor and being wholly subjugated to academic pursuits, I worked as an orderly at Byron House. For me, the work was more than just a way to pay my university tuition. It allowed me to come close to the unseen realm of lunacy and craziness. Byron House was previously a home for older people. Still, it was shuttered for unexplained reasons before being purchased and privately opened by Dr. Samuel Monroe as a home for the mentally ill. I knew the house long before I started working there. Everyone in Barton did. In my childhood, it was the ideal haunted home for me and my small group of pals, whereas they saw the structure as a cheap thrill. Calling out the staff and inhabitants before fleeing, I saw it with a chilling but alluring dread. Even the morbid fascinated me. My mind was attracted by anything other than wraiths bound in shackles or groaning specters. No, Byron's phantoms were encased in the crippled gray flesh of its aged residents. I'd watched them stumbling around its grounds, waiting, perhaps even hoping, for death to swoop in and take them. I sat immobile behind a hedge for hours, watching their thin, brittle bodies walk across the vast lawns, totally unconscious of the morbidity of their surroundings. I made a promise to myself one day that I would never let old age take me. I was resolved to die young and energetic. Better to die abruptly in the throes of youth than to rust away within the walls of the tomb-like Byron House. Time has gone, and I have failed to uphold my promise. I've considered suicide several times, but something has always kept me from doing so. I began my employment as a fresh-faced, innocent youth eager to learn everything I could from honest, hands-on experience. There were 12 inmates of the residence, each suffering from a complex cocktail of mental disorders and psychosis. 8 staff personnel from varying positions oversaw and cared for the detainees. Dr. Monroe was at the very top, and the orderlies, including myself, were at the bottom. The detainee states varied dramatically, from hysteria to monomania, and psychopathy to feeble-mindedness and retardation. My co-workers were likewise a mixed bag. Williams, an ape-like man with a massive build, stood out for restraining rioting inmates, as well as occasionally hitting them if the allegations about him were accurate. Another highlight was Jane, a well-mannered but somewhat jaded divorcee entering her 50s. Jane was a part of the government's new nurse training program, and she was always available to give guidance on how to administer medication. But there was no warmth in her demeanor toward the inmates, and I often wondered why she chose this vocation for herself. Then there was Dr. Monroe, who appeared remote and stern. I had the idea that he despised his position at the mansion and was rarely seen outside of his office. In addition to those three, there were several newcomers, including several students like myself and some local strongmen who were only good for lifting and caring for uncooperative inmates. I'm sorry that I can't recall any more names or faces. Despite the impact it had on my life, my stay at Byron House was thankfully brief. Now, I mentioned there were 12 inmates, and that was what I expected when I started my job. However, I rapidly discovered this through staff gossip. I whispered hearsay that a 13th convict was being treated at the house, a rare and unusual inmate whose condition was so severe that Dr. Monroe personally provided specialist care. I later found out that this inmate's name was Jonathan Spencer. The staff gave him the foreboding nickname 13, and he lived at the top of the home in the attic space, which had been remodeled explicitly for him. Unlike the other convicts, who were allowed to visit their relatives on occasion, 13 of them never left the residence. He never left his attic chamber, and all personnel except Dr. Monroe were barred from visiting the upper floor of the house. Jane once told me a story about a younger woman who started working as a porter at the house several years ago. She'd been working the graveyard shift, and Monroe was abroad on a rare occasion to give a lecture at Manchester University, leaving her alone. She had heard 13 banging around above and, despite being advised never to approach the top floor, decided to walk up to the attic to make sure everything was fine. After exploring, she ran screaming from the house into the night, never to return. After that, Monroe became even more concerned about exposing Spencer to the rest of the staff, and he would frequently sleep over at the house in his office to prevent a similar scenario from occurring. Although she disliked Monroe, Jane was relieved that the grim man spent the majority of his time at home. This meant that she wouldn't have to deal with 13 in any way. Spencer had always lived in the attic, as far as she knew, even before she started working there, which had been much longer than she wanted to acknowledge. Williams had little to say about the subject. He appeared to believe that 13's condition was more physical than cerebral, and that his body was deformed rather than his mind. Even though the man was enormous and not afraid of the other inmates, he became nervous while working on the top floors of the mansion. Monroe was eager to punish rebellious inmates with Williams, but as a lackey, he was not permitted near the attic. Between myself and the other orderlies, 13 was a regular source of gossip. We had never seen or heard from him, and aside from that one horrible moment in time, we would never see him again. My interest in the attic and its tenant grew by the day, but Monroe was fiercely protective of Spencer's well-being. Despite my willingness to assist, the doctor dismissed my questions with an angry wave of his hand. As luck would have it, I was granted entry into that strange, dark world where few humans have ventured, and it happened sooner than I expected. It was December, and I had been working at home for a little less than 2 months when Jane entered the staff room one morning with a cup of coffee, a pack of cigarettes, and an expression of sheer rage on her ashen face. I had never spotted her smoking until that day, but she was only in the room for a few seconds before lighting a slender white stick and slumping down on the chair opposite me She did not speak to me right away or even glance at me. She sat there, almost as if stunned, drank from her coffee cup, and took the occasional long drag from her cigarette. I tried numerous times to ignore her and return to reading an article that piqued my interest, but my sight was constantly drawn back to her wide, unblinking eyes. "Okay," I responded, folding the paper and slapping it on the chair next to me. "What is it? What is wrong?" Despite the fact that Jane was my senior, we had built a casual acquaintance and spoke frequently in a frank, no-nonsense style. She finished her cigarette and instantly started another before responding to my questions. "Last night, I was on duty. I was working in the graveyard. I'm covering for a staff absence." "Oh, who's Monroe's? He's got a virus and can't risk passing it on to any of the inmates, especially..." She paused for a few seconds. 13, she said nothing. She only nodded slowly. I stopped asking questions, since I could sense she didn't want to elaborate on what happened the night before. I sat for a few minutes, contemplating. I felt this was my chance. I'd been fascinated about 13 for a while, and intended to become involved in his care. With Monroe away and sick, a window of opportunity had opened for me. "So," I continued, startling Jane, "I take it you're also working tonight." She coldly nodded, feeling ultimately defeated. "I could work on that instead. I do not mind." I even asked Monroe several times if I could assist with 13. "You see, I'm currently writing a paper for college." She cut me off and got up from her chair. "Really? You wouldn't mind?" "Well, of course. Although Monroe undoubtedly asked you to cover because you're the most senior member of staff, I'm not sure he'd be pleased if he discovered we swapped shifts." She thought for a moment before responding. "I'm not going to tell him if you don't. I can pay you directly from my paycheck. No need to adjust the schedule." I nodded in accord. "It's settled now. You finish early, and I'll stay to work the night shift. I may need to hurry home and get some clothing, but it won't take long." I live quite close. The relief that flooded her face was both pleasant and concerning, for I knew that if I accepted my offer, a good night's sleep would not be guaranteed. She perked up considerably and kept working for the remainder of the day, intending to leave shortly before 7 p.m. She was nice enough to give me a list of chores for the night shift, and I spent the remainder of the day doing my regular rounds. I don't think the significance of what I'd offered to do had fully sunk in, and I recall feeling more excited than anything else. As the daylight hours faded into the darkness of the December evening, the remainder of the staff left one by one not long after Jane did. It was only then that I realized what was going on. Williams gave me a harsh look on his way out, which made me uneasy and made me wonder if he knew more about what was in store for me than he had revealed during his various digs and jibes at me throughout the day shift. I had never worked the graveyard shift before. Others had, of course, and they had stated that, despite his unsociable personality, Dr. Monroe's presence was always reassuring. At the very least, having a normal person in the house with you was comfortable, mainly because he was a professional doctor and could manage any problem that arose from the numerous options available. But as the night wore on and the inmates were safely confined to their dormitories, I began to feel a heavy blanket of loneliness wrapping around my shoulders. At 9 p.m., I prepared Spencer's prescription and a light meal, which Jane had written down for me, along with instructions on how to serve them to him. The dinner consisted of only scrambled eggs and fresh orange juice with a straw. The medication, too, was straightforward: pain relief, nutritional supplements, and allergy treatments. Nothing in the prescription indicated that he needed to be treated for psychosis or mood stabilization. Whatever 13's disease was, I concluded that it was a physical condition that could not be cured, only treated. I pondered how much time the unlucky inhabitant had left if he was actually suffering from a physical illness. As I ascended the stairs, my tray in hand, I paused briefly at the landing on the third floor to listen for any sounds from the other convicts. After a few seconds, I resumed, convinced that there was no disturbance. This was the closest I'd gone to the attic since starting my job, and the prospect of venturing upward filled me with dread. I cleared my mind, however, and shook my misgivings aside as I approached the final set of stairs that would lead me to the lonely attic room. The steps from the third floor led straight up before curving slightly to the left. They became narrower as I rose, but the roof seemed to fall and become claustrophobic, giving me the sensation of being boxed in. I came to a halt when the bend curved even tighter, revealing the entrance to 13's room. I was around 10 steps away from the imposing wooden door. It had been painted white some time before, but enormous chalky flakes had fallen off, exposing the natural oaken surface underneath. As Jane stated, a small flap had been hastily cut out of the bottom and nailed back on. It was just wide enough to fit the tray underneath. The door appeared almost ghostly as it stood alone and silent at the top of the stairs. It was something I had only heard of in whispers, but here it stood before me in all its stark actuality. I had only taken one step toward the door when I listened to an enthusiastic movement from the other side. I say movement, but to be more specific, the exact sequence of noises that followed conveyed the impression of terrible, liquescent gestures. First, there was a quiet thud as if something had fallen from a short height. The sound was softly muffled, as if whatever had fallen had been cushioned by thick folds. At the time, I assumed that this was due to Spencer rolling out of his bed while wrapped in thick blankets, but there was a tinge of dampness to the sound that puzzled me. Second, and more repulsively, a low, dragging sound and laborious breathing could be heard. It became louder the longer I stood, but it seemed to take a long time to reach the door. It was as if whatever bulk was in the room was closing in on me with purposeful, ghoulish lethargy. Horror gripped my heart, but my rational side insisted that I keep my mind clean. In a fit of insatiable curiosity, I mounted the steps and placed a tray at the bottom of the door. Then I pulled my body down flat on the stairs, bringing my head level with a half-inch space between the floor and the bottom of the door. What greeted me on the other side would haunt me until the end of my days as a pair of bulbous, bloodshot eyes stared back at me. I don't recall running back down the stairs, but I do remember vomiting in the ground-level restroom. You may think this is a foolish reaction, but something about those eyes frightened me to the core. It could have been the unusual spacing between them, or the way they appeared to roll about sluggishly and loosely in their sockets. For some reason, I couldn't get the image of a toad or frog out of my head, as if my brain was trying to find the most apparent terrestrial comparison to the extraterrestrial eyes that had stared back at me. I spent the rest of my night shift in the staff lounge, drinking coffee and waiting for the December sun to come up. When it finally arrived, I packed my belongings and waited for Jane and the other morning workers to relieve me of my responsibilities. Jane approached me and inquired how the night had gone. I replied nothing. I guess I mustered a feeble smile and a dismissive "it was fine" before hurrying out of the building and heading home. As luck would have it, my week on shift ended the next day, and I enjoyed some free time in complete solitude at my apartment. I slept a lot, but didn't feel rested. I couldn't get those eyes out of my head, and they haunted me for days thereafter with vivid dreams. When I returned to work a few days later, I focused as much as possible on my schoolwork in the staff room. Nobody troubled me as I sat in intense concentration, studying numerous books and papers. Despite the distraction, I couldn't get that dreadful night out of my head. Dr. Monroe was still out sick, so I assumed the other staff had covered the night shifts during my week off. Nobody mentioned or reported any weird incidents or unusual encounters. Despite my shock, a morbid curiosity crept over me. I felt like I had witnessed something both horrible and instructive, and my mind was filled with a mix of terror and wonder. My mind kept returning to those eyes. What dreadful ailment could have generated such bodily lunacy of form? If I could communicate with Spencer, especially since Dr. Monroe is currently unavailable, I might be able to focus my academic work on the sad patient. At the very least, I could think of a plausible and ordinary explanation for what I had seen that night. After a few more days of doing my regular rounds, I had made up my mind. I contacted Jane and told them unequivocally that while Monroe was off sick, I would like to take over night duties in the house personally. Unsurprisingly, she was happy to accommodate my request without objection. My second shift came that night, and I reflected on my fresh focus as I prepared the prescription and evening meal to carry to the attic. Again, the setup was simple: mashed potatoes and a milky cup of tea with a straw. I gazed distastefully at the pan of steaming mush and wondered if 13 got tired of the sloppy menu Dr. Monroe had prepared for him. All of the dishes were plainly intended for someone with only the most fundamental eating abilities. It was more suitable for a newborn than a guy. With renewed resolution, I returned to the attic with my tray, this time ascending the final set of stairs without hesitating. Something greeted me at the entrance. It was not an object of dread or revulsion, but rather one that immediately made me question its authenticity as something belonging to this specific time and place. It was a small piece of plain paper, crumpled and folded numerous times, peeking out of the opening at the bottom of the door. No sound came from the room beyond, so I figured 13 was asleep. I cautiously pushed my tray under the flap to avoid disturbing the tenant behind the door, then grabbed the letter and breakfast tray left by the morning staff before quietly returning to the staff area. I dared not read the note at night, in case its contents disturbed my mind and interfered with my ability to continue working. I tucked it into my satchel, feeling a strange glistening semi-wetness on its surface. I attempted to distract myself with some university work, sometimes looking over at the bag and fighting the impulse to read Spencer's note. In the morning, I completed a fast handover with the morning workers before returning to my apartment. Usually, I would head straight to bed to catch up on sleep, but instead, I made a large pot of coffee and some bread. Taking my breakfast and notes to my study desk, I opened the windows to let the struggling December morning sun penetrate the room before sitting down and carefully unfolding the paper. Now, I'd be lying if I said the writing on the note was anything more than infantile scrawling, and at first, I didn't think there was anything worth learning from the spidery scribblings. But after a few minutes of studying and copying words onto a new sheet of paper, I was able to decipher enough of the text to read. As I stated at the beginning of this tale, I have long since destroyed any written documentation of these incidents. However, I remember enough of the note to tell you what Spencer wrote. I apologize if I shocked you the other night or frightened you. Please don't feel guilty for finding my appearance shocking. I've long since grown accustomed to such reactions. I can only assume that Dr. Monroe, for whatever reason, is unavailable to look after my well-being, and it is on that assumption that I have finally seized upon the chance to have contact with someone else. I must apologize for my disgraceful and crude writing. The man you know as Dr. Samuel Mon will not burden you with the full knowledge of what is at work here, nor my condition or cause of confinement within this house. I freely admit that I don't know exactly where I am or how much time has passed since I first came here, but that isn't important anymore. Unless specific measures are taken, I will not be long for this world. If that happens, it can only mean Monroe has achieved his grand aim. In our youth, we were close friends. The best of friends, you could say, and together, we adventured and traveled to all the forgotten corners and exotic places of the world, the Orient, the Congo, and Arabia. We explored the deepest jungles of the Indian subcontinent, the ancient sands of Egypt, and the forgotten ruins of the Americas. My condition is somewhat linked to these travels, but it is far more sinister than a simple tropical disease. Now, if I may be so bold, I need two things from you. I realize you are under no obligation to assist me, but know that if you do, You will not only be providing me with service, but also securing the future safety of all humanity. Firstly, I need you to keep our correspondence a secret. No one, especially Monroe, must suspect we are in contact. That man is wicked and will seek to harm you if he discovers you have been talking with me. Secondly, I will need you to. I'm grateful to whatever powers brought us together, and I look forward to hearing from you. The note was fascinating. I reread it several times, my coffee and toast lost among the dozens of questions racing through my thoughts. I wasn't sure whether it was even meant for me, but I gradually became certain. The eloquence of the writing was in stark contrast to the way in which it was presented, yet it clearly originated from a lively and smart mind. Regardless of how educated the author was, Spencer was clearly disturbed. There was little question that the letter had placed a pall over Dr. Monroe's actions. What form of depravity was Spencer accusing the doctor of? True, the man was hostile, cold, and abrupt. But would he genuinely want to harm me if he found out I was in communication with Spencer? I couldn't believe the idea. At this time, I was convinced that Spencer's disdain for Monroe was a delusion, a fantasy created by Spencer in his seclusion. After all, wouldn't it be natural for someone who has a mental illness to project a demonic identity onto people he perceived as his jailers? Fantasy or not, I opted to follow the advice provided to me and not inform Dr. Monroe of my contact with Spencer, if only out of a desire to keep my job rather than a fear of physical danger. I replied that morning and brought it up with Spencer when I started my next night shift. To summarize, I agreed to hear him out on the condition that he tell me everything he knew about his sickness so that I could utilize that information to help medical science. Of course, what I really wanted was a one-of-a-kind case on which to focus my academic studies and career, and I'm sure Spencer knew that on some level. Before sliding my response under the door, I sought to make verbal contact. I placed my head against the door and just murmured, "It's me. I got your note." No response came. I asked, "How did you know I would get it? Can you hear me?" My last query was stopped short by a low, bubbling, gurgling sound, a liquid reaction that pushed bile up to my throat. I fled once more, nearly as quickly as the first time I saw those dreadful eyes, and restricted myself to the staff room, where a cold sweat stopped me from getting any good rest. Early the following day, I dashed upstairs before the morning crew arrived, and to my relief, another message was waiting for me. This second letter was shorter than the first, and since I was more familiar with his writing, I was able to read it before the day's ship arrived swiftly. "I am overjoyed to hear that you will assist me. I am unsure if you are ready for all that I have to say, but you must be, for my sake as well as yours. Before that, though, I must address a few things. Last night, I was unable to respond to your questions. I did try, but as you no doubt heard, my vocal skills have atrophied to the point of uselessness. I appreciate your keen interest in my condition. I am flattered that you would consider trying to offer treatment to. My affliction is just that, a punishment handed down by callous forces that occasionally take an interest in our race, never to our benefit and always to our misery. No, I am beyond help, but I thank you for the gesture. The items I mentioned in my last letter are as follows: my diary, which I kept up until my imprisonment, and a manuscript, the title of which is DIY Mystery. Both should be in Monroe's home, and you must find a way to get them back. The following several days dragged on. I knew what Spencer wanted me to do, but I wasn't sure if I was willing to commit a felony to obtain what he wanted. He was obviously insane. There was no mistake about it, but I was still eager to learn more about him. Despite his remarks, I was confident that his illness could benefit from the study, and it was only Dr. Monroe's continuous imprisonment that prevented the medical community from providing him with any assistance. I wasn't totally prepared to break into a man's home at the request of a madman. Furthermore, Dr. Monroe was still out of work due to a virus, making a nighttime visit to his home a perilous proposition. I did not need to contact him in a social role, and I doubted he would recognize me as a co-worker. Such were the man's ways. I kept a casual conversation with Spencer, avoiding a straight response to his request, and instead delving more into his and Dr. Monroe's backgrounds. He eventually became irritated, and our little notes turned into nasty, circular debates. Spencer's sickness appeared to worsen, and he became increasingly worried. I refused to rush into a decision about recovering his notes and manuscripts, prompting him to write a succession of vitriolic scoldings. I admit that during this period, I pondered shelving the matter entirely and returning to my usual schedule of university study, or maybe leaving Byron House altogether. However, before making a decision, I took the initiative to conduct some research without telling Spencer. I didn't have much information, so I went to the nearby town of Eastwich and studied the little library. I looked for anything that addressed Lake Holly, Carcassa, Yuggoth, the Vermis Mysteriis, and the other gibberish phrases in Spencer's note. No text on geography, history, science, astronomy, or any other subject known to man mentioned Lake Holly or Yuggoth. The Vermis Mysteriis was a more successful field of study. I discovered a lot about this banned and cursed tome. It was written in 1542 by Ludwig Prynne, just before his death at the hands of the Inquisition. Throughout history, numerous translations and copies have been produced, many with unusual titles such as the Grim One or the Sackage Rituals. Its original Latin title, however, was frightening, sounding similar to the Mysteries of the Worm. The book appeared to be a collection of interrelated volumes, each more awful in subject matter and scale. Other volumes described in the text included cults to ghouls, things of the water, and the Necronomicon, the final and most terrifying masterpiece of black magic. Each book described strange places and strange times, entire cycles of myth in which the earth was ruled over by old ones and elder things, malevolent fungi from Yuggoth, faceless night gaunts, and the black goat with 1,000 young and great Cthulhu, who lay dead but dreaming in lightless, brine-soaked Relia. I openly acknowledge that most of the works were fortunately beyond my comprehension. Nonetheless, their descriptions seemed awfully sincere. I put such thoughts out of my mind. After all, at the time, I was a scientist, not a sorcerer. Still, they lingered in my mind, and I have done so every day since. After hours of digging, I came upon a brief paragraph in a recently published history book about witchcraft during Queen Elizabeth I's reign. The book mentioned a certain John Dee as a sorcerer and author of works such as Monas Hieroglyphica and notes on the mysteries of the worm. I took note of the book's author, Dr. Heron Glass, and wrote him a letter the next day, asking whether he knew anything about the Vermis Mysteriis. But I never received a response. What kind of a legal study had Spencer and Monroe engaged in? I'd always imagined the doctor was a logical man, but if Spencer is to be believed, he was once a dedicated researcher of the supernatural and an explorer of odd, dark places. My mind was exhausted from the day in the library, so I returned to my flat for an early night's sleep. My dreams, however, were everything but restful. I had a reoccurring nightmare about the first time I saw Spencer's unusual eyes. Chaotic vortices burned into my head. I found myself floating in the great void of space. I had no idea how I ended up in the ether, but I had a dim memory of having nobody and being carried on the back of something so horrible that I dared not look. The pounding of giant wings deafened my ears, and even though I had no idea where I was in space, I knew I was on my way to lightless Yuggoth, the outpost of the evil sentinel fungi. Then my nightmare scene changed, and I found myself standing at the edge of what I assumed was Lake Holly in Carcassa. Dark purple waves flowed around my ankles, thick as syrup but smelling like 1,000 rotting corpses. Something massive and terrible revolved slowly in the center of the lake, an enormous tower of plastic flesh with the parody of a face on its surface, as well as Spencer's swollen, bulging eyes. I awoke abruptly, screaming and short of breath. My bedding was wet with cool sweat, and my head throbbed in misery. I took a week off work to recover, but the dreams continued to haunt me at night. Finally, December came to an end, and Christmas passed quietly. I've never been one to overdo it over the so-called holiday season, preferring to spend most of it alone at my apartment or the local pub. When I finally got back to Byron House, I saw that Dr. Monroe had returned to work, looking much more potent after surviving the infection. He was back to his customary aloof demeanor. I was relieved, for his presence made contact with Spencer impossible, something even he would have to accept, as he appeared to be as concerned about Monroe discovering our touch as I was. By now, I was intrigued to learn more about the Vermis Mysteriis and its contents. I didn't trust anything I'd seen in my nightmares or read in books about necromancy and witchcraft. Instead, I saw it as a way to understand Spencer better. My unexpected immersion in his otherworldly hobbies reignited my urge to write a paper about him. I was convinced that I could create a pioneering book on supernatural monomania and give it over to my tutor. I had finally resolved to grant Spencer's request and steal his diary and manuscript. Not for him, of course, but for my study. Once I was finished, I could sell the book to get some money. According to all reports, it would be extremely valuable to the right buyer. I realized that my time at Byron House was coming to an end. First semester exams were approaching, and I'd have to quit my employment to concentrate on my academics. In a few weeks, I'd be away from Monroe and Spencer, returning to the normalcy of school life. Greedy for knowledge, I determined that breaking the law was worth the risk and began plotting my theft. I started to follow Monroe home on my days off. Despite his sickness, he rarely stayed at Byron House, most likely because he was still healing and preferred the comfort of his bed. This would make things challenging, of course, but I was convinced that his stubbornness would drive him to go back to old habits swiftly. I waited for him just out of sight, carefully shadowing him until I was comfortable with his routine. Fortunately, he started spending more time at Byron House. I eventually chose a night to break into his house. It was a chilly January night when I arrived at Monroe's spacious detached house on Town Court Lane. The night was clear and bitterly cold, with the moon and stars beaming brightly from the abyss above, evoking recollections of my recent dreams. I'm not going to make a big fuss about my burglary, and I'm not proud of it. Despite my inexperience, I managed to mount the high brick wall at the back of the house and, with my jacket wrapped over my hand, smashed through the small glass plate placed into the kitchen door. I wasted no time in pulling out my flashlight and thoroughly searching the lower rooms. It was not long before I came across a study. The room had a heavy scent about it, which I attributed to the plush animals and ancient tomes littering the walls. Hundreds of enormous, heavy books were propped up by drooping shelves that appeared to creak and moan under the weight. I searched the vast bookshelf for the book I required. The books were piled on top of one other haphazardly. Among the commonplace volumes on history, anthropology, and geography, I noticed numerous dark and ominous texts that had been mentioned during my visit to the Eastwich Library. Volumes like Unosprechlichen Kulten and Von Unosprechlichen Kulten stood out, as did the infamous Salino fragments. The majority of these illegal manuscripts appeared to be modern translations, but at least one was alarmingly authentic and ancient. It did not take me long to discover the Vermis Mysteriis. I gingerly slipped a crumbling copy out, allowing the remaining books to fall into the space it left behind softly. I doubted Monroe would notice a missing volume with all the noise, but I hastily repositioned the shelf to ensure there were no visible gaps. I spotted another slimmer black-bound volume attached to the back of the text, and a quick check proved it was Spencer's diary. I silently complimented Monroe's sense of propriety. Despite his disorganized collection, he must have recognized the significance of Spencer's diaries and manuscript notes. Unable to restrain my interest, I opened D. Maris Mysteries and scanned the spidery language inside. Unfortunately, the document was far too complicated to decipher with its antique Latin, so I focused on the more accessible but equally mysterious notebook. I was sure Monroe would not return home, since the house had no close neighbors. By the light of my flashlight, I sat at the enormous desk in the study and read. The notebook recounted Monroe and Spencer's travels as young men. It looked that the latter had kept his word in his note about these exploits. The diary described an ancient cult that the two had met during their travels in Central Asia, a place, or possibly even a time, known only as Lang. It also mentioned a secret society of immortal monks who guarded a magnificent treasure hidden in the heart of a massive stone monastery. This treasure, a large golden idol of a winged hound, was a potent relic capable of freeing the old ones who were trapped beyond our realm. They protected this treasure from all potential robbers, including the terrifying Chew, a race of semi-human cannibals, and the feared spiders of Lang, intelligent arachnids with their plans for humanity. Monroe's primary motivation for joining the cult seems to be his opposition to the old ones. Spencer, on the other hand, seemed far more fascinated by the cult's unusual abilities. As I went on, I learned more about their interactions with the monks, as well as the immortality secrets that they might teach outsiders. Spencer appeared to have gotten his desire and met the group's deathless leaders. However, the encounter had become sour, and in retribution, he decided to steal the golden idol and flee. Monroe was reluctant to accompany him, but due to guilt by association, he was obliged to depart for his safety. Throughout their journey back to England, the two were at odds over the destiny of the idol. Monroe wanted to get rid of the object, but Spencer refused, claiming that the black secrets inside would allow them to live forever as gods on Earth. At some point, the two parted ways, with Monroe holding the idol and Spencer holding nothing. Spencer became severely suspicious and resentful after Monroe's departure, confident that either the cult or Monroe had cursed him. He began by discussing symptoms that had undoubtedly contributed to his current predicament. I tried my hardest to find the idol, which was meticulously drawn on a diary page, but my efforts were in vain. I assumed Monroe still had it, but it was probably concealed somewhere in his house or office at Byron. Regardless, it was time for me to depart. I didn't sleep well after reading Spencer's diary. My nightmares became more vivid and severe. I felt as if I were being thrown into dismal Erebus, my wounded soul constantly insulted by the diary's blasphemous revelations. On the morning of my last shift at Byron House, I sat and mused over an untouched cup of coffee. I had read a lot in the previous few weeks, and while I was confident that the whole subject of magic old gods and Yuggoth was purely fictitious, I couldn't shake an awful sense of reality from what I had read. If everything stated in the diary was accurate, Monroe appears to have put an end to Spencer's quest for immortality and locked him up in the attic to eliminate any threat he posed to humanity. However, due to my nightmares, I was soon growing tired of the entire situation. It was pushing my mind to the breaking point, and my schoolwork suffered as a result. I reasoned that if some lunatic inmate demanded his book back, who was I to refuse him? Better to get rid of the things, eliminate all memories of elder gods and old ones, and return to my studies. Forget about the entire incident and my role in it. I secretly considered returning the books to Monroe's house, but the damaged window I left behind indicated that he was aware of the crime. He appeared to be spending more time at home lately, and I heard he had purchased a pretty large German Shepherd to protect his home. Possession of the books would clearly indicate my guilt. If he suspected me, the local police would not have to search my tiny apartment to discover them. I could have discarded them, but that seemed irresponsible given their contents. Selling them was an option and my original plan, but I considered who would be interested in purchasing the books and for what reason. I slipped the manuscript and Spencer's diary into one of my folders and got to work. I marched up to the attic as soon as possible when the other staff were occupied, and there was a pause in action. After a brief pause, I placed the diary and mrcreeps in front of the door and knocked once before quickly exiting. Since then, I've worked irregularly at Byron House. I had intended to quit, but a few additional shifts came my way, and I was in no position to decline the money. I discovered a method to balance my career and schooling, and I only worked day shifts. The dreams gradually subsided, and I was able to sleep well. I was looking forward to clearing my examinations and beginning a new semester at university. It felt like normalcy was returning to my life. However, I noticed an unusual change in Monroe. As the days passed, he showed signs of acute stress and appeared to be weakening. The sickness that had troubled him a few weeks before seemed to have returned, and I even saw him cough up a small amount of blood into his handkerchief. His demeanor became serious. Large black rings grew around his eyes, and deep creases appeared on his brow. He seemed not only to be ravaged by illness, but also to be highly concerned. He was less harsh than usual, and he even sought to strike up a light discussion with the other employees in an almost resigned and defeated tone. He eventually became unwell and had to leave work again, but this time he never returned. We learned a few days later that he had died of heart failure, which was not surprising given his age and recent stress, but it still disturbed me greatly. His death plagued my mind because, if what I dared to suspect was true, then I had somehow contributed to his death, as had Spencer with that damn manuscript. Now, James, we are nearing the finish of my story. It's taken a while to get here, and I admit that I may have dragged out the affair longer than I planned. If I have, it is simply because I detest writing what needs to be written down. It is the only way you would understand what I said at the beginning of this tale. I now encourage you to refrain from future involvement in this situation. Avoid thinking about the occult and witchcraft. There are some things that humans should not and cannot know. Black magic is definitely the devil's handiwork. James, if you are so motivated, you can conduct your research on the history of Byron House. If you do, you will discover that on a February evening approximately 60 years ago, the mansion was burned down to its foundations with only one victim. You may also find that not long after, Dr. Monroe's home was broken into, and a significant chunk of his private book collection was burned to ashes in his backyard. No one was ever arrested for these offenses. Of course, there were suspects: disgruntled former employees, former detainees, and possibly a naive and youthful orderly studying psychiatry at the University of Manchester. However, the authorities were never able to identify the offender. Much time has passed, and I'm not as sharp as I once was. Nonetheless, I will recount the terror in as much detail as possible, and perhaps you will abandon your research. As a reward for good behavior, the staff and inmates at Byron House took a trip into the countryside once a month, allowing everyone to enjoy some good old-fashioned fresh air. Spencer was exempt from these trips due to physical limitations, and he would ordinarily have stayed home with Dr. Monroe while the rest of the family went out. However, with Monroe gone, none of the crew were willing to stick behind to care for Spencer's requirements. Instead, a tray of food was placed outside his attic door, and the servants and inmates left the house for a few days. I had made it plain that my college studies needed to be prioritized, and that I would be unable to continue working at Byron House. I departed shortly after Dr. Monroe died, and never contacted Jane Williams, or anybody else at the residence. I caught the train from Piccadilly to Eastwich, confident that one of the lads with whom I now share my student accommodations in Manchester would be able to offer me an alibi if necessary. I then boarded the last bus to Barton and waited for Williams, James, and the other inmates they cared after to leave, allowing me to sneak in. I returned to the attic with a sorrowful heart and a worried mind. By this point, the nightmares had returned. Only now did they show the pained spirit of Monroe weeping to me from beyond the dead. I freely acknowledge that I was possibly insane at the time. What reasonable man would have done what I did on that cold February night? I was sure that the fate of all humanity was at stake. That Lang, Hugo, and Kakasa were all very real, and that the old ones waited patiently in their ancient prisons to return to Earth. I can't tell you that I don't still believe these things, but that's my burden, not yours. As I mustered all of my bravery and stood before the door, a voice slurred from beyond. To this day, I'm not sure if I genuinely heard these words or if they materialized in my thoughts. But those slimy, slopping liquid sentences spoke to me, and I dared not respond. You did well. The KY mine. Monroe denied. Killed him. Called it down from the stars. The ritual soul is next to the gods. It fed off him. ELD to one feast. Now Monroe burns. Body returning. Freedom, your help. You're next. My mind raced with bewilderment and my heart hammered with panic. In a fit of rage, I kicked down the door and stared at Jonathan Spencer's former body. What have I seen? It's impossible to describe in detail, but what I saw prompted me to escape the attic in a fit of howling lunacy, returning with gasoline and matches. Whatever it was, I was persuaded that only the purifying power of fire could remove its hideous deformity from the planet. For flailing on the attic floor was a great mass of gelatinous, decaying, fungoid flesh, writhing beneath the weight of its hideousness. Parts of it were splashed on the ceiling and walls, but the majority was spread out in boiling pools on the bare attic floor. Unblinking, bulbous eyes swept across the quivering mound before fixing on me with the intensity of a dying star. Appendages and pseudo-appendages emerged from within, only to collapse into grotesque, protoplasmic tissue that squirmed on its own. I believe I saw a face, or bits of a face, crawling on the surface of that monstrous bulk. It was a putrid thing that had been under Lang's curse for more than half a century, a glob of wriggling meat in the shape of Jonathan Spencer, inmate number 13, the shambler in the attic.